Today's daf we're going to be learning is Avodah Zarah daf Kaf Aleph. There's a study guide and I recommend you use it. It has a chart that's going to chart out the topics we're going to discuss in the Mishnah, the machloket between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi. So we're going to get started. Oh, I just realized one thing. Sorry. I just realized. Today's daf we're going to be learning is Avodah Zarah daf Kaf Aleph. We're going to continue in this topic and really delve into it of the isur of lo techanim. Okay, not selling land to non-Jews, which we're going to talk about what exactly does it mean non-Jews. Is it everyone? Is it some people? And all that. And what other issues came out of it. Okay, extensions of it. So we're going to start with a Mishnah, and I highly recommend you use the study guide. I'm having some issues with the share screen today, so I'm not going to be able to share screen for the video, but I recommend you use it. It'll definitely help you with understanding the machloket between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi in the Mishnah. And with that, we're going to get started. I color-coded it a little bit so you see that Rabbi Yossi is going to basically be lenient one level in all the issues. We're going to talk about 3 different areas and what is permitted or forbidden to do in each area. What I did is to organize it, since the Mishnah talks kind of mixes what's permitted, what's forbidden. I did one chart, what's permitted, and one chart, what's forbidden. I thought that was an easier way to be able to, if you wanted to view one or the other at any given point, instead of seeing all as a big mush, you could clarify what's forbidden, what's permitted in each area according to who. So we have 3 areas: Israel, Syria, which is not exactly only modern day Syria, but likely also Lebanon as well, and Chutz La'aretz. Now, the area that we call Syria is the area that David HaMelech conquered and expanded the borders of Israel, and we're going to call that kibush yachid. It's an individual conquering. What does it mean individual? It wasn't individual, it was David HaMelech, but what it means is it was conquered outside of, beyond the borders of what Israel was supposed to be, or what they were supposed to conquer when they went into the land, and therefore it's in this in-between area where it's sort of Israel, but sort of not Israel, and we're going to see. And in general, there's a debate about how to treat the area, and that's going to affect one of the issues here of the debate between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi, perhaps a different perspective on what they think about that topic. Is it considered like Israel, or is it not considered like Israel? And also because of its proximity, there was concern that if we permit things there, people might not know that there's such a difference, and they'll permit things in Israel. I would say one of the major topics of today is Gezerah. Okay, when we say we're going to forbid something on account of something else, and then the question is when. What things are we going to forbid on account of other things, and where do we draw the line and say, okay, we're not going to make a Gezerah on that. So those are some overall issues that you need to know. And then there's Chutz La'aretz, which is anywhere else. Okay, not Israel, not Syria, or Syria, let's call it, because I don't want you to get confused with modern day Syria, completely anyway. And Israel, Syria, and outside, Chutz La'aretz. So we're going to start off with the Mishnah, and then we'll get into, as we get along, we'll talk a little bit about this whole isur of lo techanim and the applications of it. So Amos Kirim Lahem, we're starting at the bottom of Kaf Amibet. Amos Kirim Lahem Batim Be'eretz Yisrael ve'ein tzarich lomar sadot. You can't rent, okay, lahem, okay, it doesn't even define lahem, but we mean, right, we already talked about in the previous Mishnah that anything attached to the ground is like the ground itself, which is forbidden. And now we're getting to the isur itself, which is we can't sell, okay, again, doesn't say, but let's say idol worshippers. Okay, we'll get back to who this includes later and debates about that. Houses in Israel. And ein tzarich lomar sadot, and of course you don't need to say fields. Now we don't know yet why fields are so much more obvious. But what we're basically saying here is, without they haven't told you this yet, but you can't rent them houses or fields because you might come to sell them fields, which is forbidden. Okay, we know the isur of lo techanim. Don't give them chanaya b'karka. Don't give them any sense of any type of permanence in the land. So therefore, and obviously that pasuk was talking about Israel specifically, we can't give them permanence in the land. We can't even rent to them. Because if we rent, they might come to sell. I want to just remind you, we had this concept before, but in the reverse. We're not allowed to sell animals, big animals, to Gentiles. Why? Because we might come to rent them. And if we rent to them, what's the problem? Well, then our animal is doing work on Shabbat. So there it was the opposite. We made a Gezerah on selling because of renting. Here, we're doing the flip. It's forbidden to sell, and therefore we also can't rent. Okay, that's the first opinion of the rabbis. You can't rent, you can't sell, basically you can't do anything in Israel. Not renting, not selling. We're going to talk about renting and selling of houses and fields. Those are the 4 parameters. Renting a house, selling a house. Renting a field, selling a field. Right? Renting, we mean renting out to a Gentile. Ubesuria maskirim lehem batim avalo sadot. Now in this in-between area, Syria, we're allowed to rent them houses, but we're not allowed to rent them fields. So you see, every time we're going to see that the fields, perhaps we're going to treat the fields in a more stricter manner. Now, when everything was forbidden, there was no reason to be stricter in fields. That was as strict as we can get. But when we're going to be lenient in the houses and permit renting, we're going to be strict in the fields and not allow renting either. So, if we want to say what's permitted is to rent a house, rent out a house, but not fields, not renting fields, and obviously not selling or renting houses or fields in Syria. Ubechutz la'aretz, only in the Gemara we'll get to what exactly is the gzeira in each case. Ubechutz la'aretz, mochrim lehem batim umaskirim sadot divrei Rabbi Meir. Outside of Israel, you're allowed to sell them houses, and obviously then you can rent them houses, rent out houses, and you can rent out fields, but you can't sell fields, because again, the most strict is going to be the field, and the most strict is going to be the selling them. So the only thing we forbid in Chutz La'aretz is the most strict thing, the item we have to be the most strict about, which is selling fields. Divrei Rabbi Meir. That's all Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yossi Omer. Be'eretz Yisrael maskirim lehem batim avalos sadot. Okay, now again, what he's going to do is whatever Rabbi Meir permitted in Syria, he's going to permit in Israel, and whatever they permitted in Chutz La'aretz, Rabbi Meir permitted in Chutz La'aretz, Rabbi Yossi is going to permit in Syria. Everything's going to jump up a level. We're going to be one level more lenient in every situation. That's why I color-coded it on the study guide so you could see what matches what. So in Israel, what can you do? Okay, remember, Rabbi Meir said nothing. Rabbi Yossi says you can rent houses. That's right. That's what Rabbi Meir permitted actually in Syria, and Rabbi Yossi is going to permit that in Israel. So you can rent houses, but you can't sell houses. You can't sell fields, and you can't rent out fields. Ubesuria mochrim batim umaskirim sadot. Again, let's just say it more simply. The only thing you can't do is selling a field. And in Chutz La'aretz mochrim elu ve'elu. Everything completely is permitted outside of Israel. We're going to get into all this when we get to the Gemara. Now the Gemara is going to say, Af b'makom shamru la'askil. Now, even when they permitted, we actually read this line a few dapim ago, even in the places where they permit to rent, okay? So there's going to be certain areas we saw, depending on Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Meir, where it is permitted to rent a house out. Lo lebeit dira amru. Well, when we say you can rent out a house, by the way, we don't mean you could sell it for living purposes. Mipnei shu machnis l'tocha avodah zarah. Shene'emar lo tavi to'eva al beitecha. It's still your house. And he says you can't bring any idols into your house. They're to'eva, they're despicable. And therefore, you can't allow anyone to bring idols into your house if you rent out a house to, now here it's very clear, to an idol worshiper, because if they're not idol worshipers, they're not bringing idols into your house. If you rent it out to an idol worshiper, they will bring idols into your house, or they'll likely bring idols into the house, and then it's a problem because you're not allowed in your own house to have idols. And in all the cases, even when it's permitted to rent out and all that, okay, you cannot rent out a bathhouse. Why not? Because it's called in your name. Okay, so what? Well, here's the problem, and then we're going to go back and summarize the whole Mishnah because there's multiple issues going on here. This is a totally different problem, which, by the way, would apply to any Gentile, which is they're going to work the bathhouse on Shabbat. Going back to the issue I mentioned about the Beit Magasa, it's going to be a problem of it's called in your name, just like the animal. When you rent it out, it's still your animal, and everyone knows it's your animal. Here also, the bathhouse is called Cohen's bathhouse. Everyone knows it as that. And when someone's operating the bathhouse on Shabbat because they rented out the bathhouse to be using, well, people are going to say, oh, look, Cohen's bathhouse is working on Shabbat. And that's not good, right? We don't, just like there's Shvitat Behemah, there's also Shvitat Kelim, and also like people are going to think that people are working for you and that you have your business open on Shabbat. So we have multiple issues going on here. If we start from the end to the beginning, because the beginning one is the more complicated, amorphous one, so let's start with what's clear. You can't have someone doing work in your house on Shabbat or your bathhouse or whatever it might be that people are going to think you're doing work on Shabbat. People are going to talk about it like that. And it looks like you're working on Shabbat. Number two, you can't have a situation where somebody brings idols into your house, even if they're renting your house. It's still your house. And number three, we have this Isur of Lo Techanim. So now I want to digress for a little bit and talk about, okay, we have a short daf, so it gives us an opportunity to talk about this issue of Lo Techanim. Also, Alana's shir this week. I'm not 100% sure exactly what it's on. I haven't gotten it yet, but it's going to be somewhat about, let me just look exactly what she wrote. It wasn't 100%, but it'll be on the topic of, like, it'll relate to this Jewish, non-Jewish issue, which is obviously a very hot and interesting topic. And, okay, it's not coming up for me here. It'll be Jew and non-Jew in Israel then and now. 3 halachic bases for minority rights. Not 100% sure what that is, but it sounds intriguing. Okay, now, Lo Techanim is a big topic because what it means is, right, you can't sell land to Gentiles in Israel. Now the question is, what Gentiles and what are we talking about? So there's a variety of opinions, okay? Tosfos suggests that maybe it only means idol worshippers. Maybe it only means the 7 nations, right? Because this whole thing was mentioned in the context in Sefer Dvarim about when you get into the land and you conquer the 7 nations. Now, if you say it's time about the 7 nations, part of the issue is that people did sell land to Gentiles. And then the rabbis later come and say, well, how is it that people are doing this when it seems pretty clear it's forbidden? So then their job is to try to either justify or say it's wrong what people are doing. So one option is to say this is totally irrelevant nowadays. We don't have the 7 nations anymore. And the people that we're talking about here are the people of the 7 nations. Because again, and what's the idea of Lo Techanim? We don't want them having any permanence in the land because what does it say all over Sefer Dvarim? When you get into the land, you have to wipe out their idols. You have to wipe out, because they're doing bad things. You have to wipe out the people. They're evil people. They're going to influence you, and you're going to be influenced by evil people and end up engaging in terrible behaviors. And then that was when we got into the land, and that was the 7 nations that represented, evil in the world. That's the way they certainly are depicted in Sefer Dvarim. Right? We don't know exactly all the reality, but that's how it depicts it. This is like uprooting evil. And then it's very localized to the 7 Amim, which at this point they don't exist anymore. We don't know who was, if there are even any remains of these 7 nations, and the whole entire thing is a moot point, irrelevant. Some people say it's specifically idol worshippers. Okay, that's the Rashba and the Meiri. Meiri is famous for saying most places when it says Akum in the Gemara, it's talking about idol worshippers only. And then we're going to limit this specifically to idol worshippers. Even when we say idol worshippers, it's a good question whether we're talking about the idol worshippers of today, whether that's the same thing, and how much it's similar. That's a question, because again, the idol worshippers that we talk about were steeped in all sorts of terrible behaviors, as we see from all these live sugyot that we learn, and it's not clear that the idol worshippers of today are doing those same things, right? It's likely they're not, but it could be that just idol worship in and of itself, because it's so different from what we believe in, perhaps that's an issue. Tosfot rejects that possibility, and in fact the Shulchan Aruch paskins that it's talking about all Gentiles. And what I wanted to point out, though, that Rav Avodah Yosef says, had the Shulchan Aruch had Rav Yosef Karo seen the Rashba and Meiri, he certainly would have agreed with them. Okay, which is a fascinating line. Okay, only someone of Rav Avadia's stature would have the confidence to say something like that, right? But basically saying, even though the Shulchan Aruch didn't paskin this way, we should paskin this way. And by the way, this whole context and issue was raised in in our last century because of Heter Mechira, because they wanted to permit selling land to Gentiles to deal with the Shemitah problem. But how could we do that, right? And therefore Rav Kook talks about this issue very much, and he says, well, when there's no Kedushat Haaretz, because at this point there's no Kedushat Haaretz anymore, it's only rabbinic, all these mitzvot liot ba'aretz and all that, and therefore we can be lenient in general because there's no Kedushat Haaretz anymore. You're going to see the connection to Kedushat Haaretz. It's going to come up later about the fields. So basically, they're all minimizing this whole issue, okay, in all different ways. Some people say, by the way, you can't sell them land if they don't have land in Israel. If they already have land in Israel, then it's not a problem. Let's say for, if they sell a house and rebuy a house, that's not a problem at all. So there's all sorts of different ways of looking at this and ways that they tried to minimize this prohibition. Okay, with that was a little background, a little off the daf. Now we're going to go on. There was one other thing. Right. Okay, another thing I wanted to point out. The Rosh says about the renting out your house, because remember, there's 3 issues going on here, and one of them is renting out your house because they're going to put idols in it. So the Rosh says that we don't have to worry about anymore, because number one, they don't usually put idols in their houses anymore. It just wasn't done where he was living in France and in Spain. And then he also says, this is a great line, he says their rentals are viewed, the way we do rentals, like in where he was living, are viewed like sales. That the house is no longer really called the house of so-and-so. It's not like it's really your house when it's rented out. And because the way that people, or the perspective that people have on house rentals has changed, so therefore this is irrelevant. And it wouldn't be like there's idols in your house, which is also fascinating. Because again, is likely influenced by the fact that people were doing it and they needed to do it, right? They needed to rent out their properties to make money or whatever it might be. So anyway, it's fascinating to look at this. If we have time, we'll even look at another Tosfot later in the daf about some other topic we're going to get to, which is really interesting. Okay, now we're going to get to the Gemara. My ein sarich lomar sadot. So why is it so obvious that a field is worse? And the whole Mishnah is built on the fact, both opinions, that we're always going to be more strict on the field. Elam, now they're going to suggest something they're going to reject, but they're actually then going to reinstate it. So this is really the answer. If you say Mishum De'ipe Tarte, because it has 2 issues. Now we're going to introduce an issue we didn't even discuss yet. Chada Chanayat Karka. One, Lo Techanem, we don't want to give them any permanence in the land. V'chada Dekamafkale Mimaser. The second is that we're uprooting the mitzvah of Maaser, because we're basically giving it over to a Gentile who's not going to treat the land with sanctity and not bring Trumot and Maasro. Tosfot points out that there's homachloket about when a Gentile acquires land in Israel, does the Kedusha leave it basically, or is the Kedusha there still? And it's just that the Gentile owns it. So he tries to suggest that, he says, there are some who explain that the sugya is even if you say they don't acquire it, okay, and it doesn't uproot it from Maaser, and there's one option is to be most obvious, which is, it says here you can't sell them a field. Why can't you sell them a field? Because it's going to uproot all of the Kedusha to the land, right, in the place where they purchase. There'll be no Kedusha anymore. So it sounds like Yesh Kinyan La'akum Lafkia, right? When the Akum buys land, there's no longer, right, there's no obligation on that land for Trumah Namaskot. And that's the problem here. But he suggests that there are those who say, actually Tosfot doesn't agree with this, but there are those who say that the sugya can even work, even if you think they're not uprooting. They're still, so a Gentile comes in, buys your land, still has sanctity. You're still supposed to take Trumot Masrot. What's the problem? Well, a Gentile's living there. They're not taking Trumot Masrot. And then that's also a problem, because then there's just Trumot Masrot aren't being taken when they should be. So either it's because you're creating a situation where there's no longer sanctity in that area, meaning there's no obligation to do the mitzvah, or there is obligation and just nobody's doing them. Those are 2 ways to look at this. Either which way, a field is much worse, because it has 2 issues, Chanayah, Lo Techanem, and uprooting the Kedusha of the Maaser and the Truma and all that. Ihachi, batimnami yikatarte. But remember, this was introduced in Ilema. If you're going to say, houses also have 2 issues. Let's go through the 2 issues. Chada chanayat karka, again, lo techanem, okay. V'chada dekamafkalemi mezuzah. If you're talking about uprooting the Kedusha Shvid or the Kedusha Haaretz or the Maaser, well, here people aren't going to put mezuzahs on their door. So Amar Masharshi mezuzah chovat hadarhu. He said, no, mezuzah is very different. Mezuzah, the obligation, this is very practical halacha. If you rent a place and there's no mezuzahs, the obligation is on you. Or if you rent out your house and you hadn't put up mezuzahs yet, the obligation isn't on you to make sure there's mezuzahs there, right? You're not allowed to take down your mezuzahs. But you can't, if you, let's say, build a new house and immediately rent it out, the obligation is not on you to make sure there's mezuzahs there. The obligation is on the person renting. It's the person who comes into the house that has to put the mezuzah. So that's different, because the obligation is on the person who happens to be living in the house at that moment. The land is an obligation on the land. So that's different. That will be uprooted. Mezuzah is viewed very differently. B'Syria maskirim batim. Now we're going to go into all the different opinions and under all the different situations and according to all the opinions. So we're starting with Rabbi Meir. We're going to go through the Rabbi Meir's comments. So in Eretz Israel, everything's forbidden. The Gemara doesn't go into this, but obviously why? Well, it's forbidden to sell, and it's forbidden, right, land and houses. We already discussed why that is, right? Houses for one reason, lo t'chanem, land for two reasons, lo t'chanem, and uprooting the sanctity. Because of that, we're going to make a gzerah. This was so obvious I didn't need to tell you this. Don't rent out houses, don't rent out fields, because if you rent it, you might come to sell it. Okay, that's a gzerah. B'Syria, what did we say? Maskirim batim, but not sadot. You can rent out houses, but you can't rent out fields. So, ma'ishna mechira delo, mishum mechira de'eretz Yisrael. Now, why can't you sell the house? Because we don't want you to sell a house in Syria, because if we allow you to sell it in Syria, you might think that you could sell it in Israel also, because you'll get confused where exactly the boundaries are. What, is there really a difference? Kibush yachid, kibush, of kibush, the stuff that was conquered by Yoshua, in that time. So you might make a mistake. But for that reason, well, if selling in Israel is forbidden and renting houses in Israel is forbidden, and we're going to say that selling houses in Syria is forbidden because you might come to sell houses in Israel, why don't we say renting houses in Syria is forbidden because you might come to rent in Israel as well? So the obvious answer is, remember, why can't you rent? Because you might come to sell. Why can't you sell? Because it itself is forbidden. So, he guf gzera, the whole renting in Israel is only a gzera anyway. We don't generally make a gzera an gzera. If renting is forbidden in Israel because of a gzera, so that you don't come to sell, we're not going to say, well, don't do it in Syria, don't rent, because you might come to rent in Israel. Okay? Again, every time I'm going to use rent here, I'm not going to keep repeating it, but it always means rent out. Not to rent yourself, but to rent out to somebody else. Because obviously we're talking about a Jew renting out to a Gentile. Again, Gentile being defined as probably more likely idol worshiper or one of the 7 nations. V'ha-schirut sadeh de b'Syria. Now wait. The schirut of a field, now we just said we're not going to do gzera and gzera, but look, we are doing gzera and gzera, because what did Rabbi Meir say? Rabbi Meir said you can't rent out a field in Syria. Now, why can't you rent out a field in Syria? Because you might come to rent out a field in Israel. And what's the problem of renting out a field in Israel? You might come to sell. That's gzera and gzera. So, haschirut sadeh b'Syria, gzera l'gzera hi b'kagazrina. That's gzera and gzera, and we still forbid it. So they say, hatam lav gzerahu. They say, renting out a field in Israel is actually not a gzera. And therefore, renting out in Syria is going to be forbidden, because you might come to rent out in Israel. Why is renting out in Israel not a gzera? Kasavar kibush yachid shmei kibush. They say, okay, now we're going to say that Rabbi Meir holds that the kibush of David was kibush, and Syria is considered part of Israel proper once it was conquered by David. Which means, now, what's the problem? Well, he didn't say that renting a house in Syria is a problem. So why specifically a field, not a house? Well, this is going to be the same thing we're going to say over and over, which is sadedi betarte gazru berabanan, batim delebu tarte lo gazru bu rabanan. Now, even though kibush achidish me kibush, it's obvious it's still a little bit different, and therefore we're going to say when it comes to the more stricter, which is the field, they're going to forbid even renting. But when it comes to the houses, they're not going to forbid renting in Syria. B'chutz la'aretz. So now we get to the last one, which is in chutz la'aretz. The only thing that's forbidden is selling a field, but nothing else. So sadedi betarte, again, same thing we're going to keep saying. Since the field has 2 issues to it, gazru buhu rabanan. So the rabbi said, even in chutz la'aretz, where obviously all these issues are irrelevant, we're going to forbid the thing that's the absolute more harshest, which is selling a field. Selling a field in Israel is a problem. We don't want you to sell fields in chutz la'aretz because you might come to Israel and think that you can sell fields to Gentiles. So, batim delepu tarte, but houses, since there's only one issue, lo gazru bu rabanan. The rabbis didn't make any sort of decree. That's all Rabbi Meir. Now we're going to move on to Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi Omer, be'eretz Yisrael maskirim lehem batim. So in Israel, you can even rent houses, right? He doesn't have any prohibition for renting houses. Everything else is forbidden, but renting houses is okay. My taima, again, same thing we said, obviously, because whatever Rabbi Yossi says, it's very similar to what Rabbi Meir said in the other place. Sadoti butarte gazru b'Rabbanan, batim tele butarte lo gazru b'Rabbanan. Okay, they only made Xera in Israel. Renting is forbidden. Renting is forbidden because you might sell only for the harshest, which is the field. But there was no reason to make Xera on the house, which was less harsh. Syria, muchrim. Okay, what's this? In Syria, muchrim, you can sell a house. Okay, and you can sell a field. Okay, that's what Rabbi Yossi holds. You just can't. What can't you do? You can't sell. You can. Did I say that? I think I might have said it wrong. Let's go back. You can sell and rent a house, and you can rent a field. You just can't sell a house. That was what the rabbis forbade in Rabbi Meir forbade in Chutz La'aretz. Rabbi Yossi forbids in Syria. My taima kasaval. Why is everything else permitted? Obviously, he holds kibush yachid lo shmei kibush. Right? Number one, he's not going to be strict because he doesn't view this as part of Israel, for the rules of Israel and all the kedusha haaretz and all that. But and lo techanem isn't relevant there. But sadedi beitarte gazru b'Rabbanan. In case you haven't gotten this yet, sadeh has two issues. Because of the two issues, we're going to be strict and we're going to be gozer in Syria, specifically the selling. Don't sell here, lest you might come to sell in Israel. But everything else, batim delei butarte lo gazru b'Rabbanan. There was no reason to make a gzera on the houses. Ubechutz la'aretz mochrim. Now, outside of Israel, you can sell everything, and you can rent everything. Everything's permitted in Chutz La'aretz according to Rabbi Yossi. Why is that? My taima, kevan de merchak lo gazrinan. It's so far away, there's no reason to make a gzera. Okay, there's absolutely no point. The only reason why Syria, according to Rabbi Yossi, because if kibush is not kibush, right? Kibush yachid. The only reason to forbid in Syria, and according to the Rabbi Meir, you had to forbid because it was even considered Israel for certain issues, or right, it had the laws like Israel. Rabbi Yossi is because of its proximity. Right? People will get confused maybe where the border is, or they'll move from place to place more easily because they're right nearby, and they'll forget the laws. They'll think, oh, that's anywhere, that's the rule. So it's proximity. Here it's so far away, there's no reason to worry. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel halacha ki Rabbi Yossi. So Rabbi Yehuda paskins like Rabbi Yossi in the name of Shmuel. Amar Rabbi Yosef, but now Rabbi Yosef says, but wait, there is one issue. Okay, so we paskin like Rabbi Yossi where we're lenient. Let's say in Chutz La'aretz you could do anything you want. Amar Rav Yosef u'bavad shalei asena shchuna. Bringing up another issue that we haven't discussed yet. Don't make it a community. Okay, we can't sell a slew of houses. Perhaps he even means like a slew of houses in a row. How many? We're going to see right now. Kama shchuna. Tana, there's a brayta that says ein shchuna pchuta mishlosha bnei adam. What it means a neighborhood is 3 different people. Like if you sell 3 houses, and perhaps we even mean right next to each other, to 3 different Gentiles, it's a problem. Now, what's the issue? The issue here seems to be that we're nervous. Now, you have to, again, put this in a historical context in a particular place, and it wouldn't necessarily apply in general. We're Gentiles, and we see this in a bunch of sugyot. There was a fear that the Gentiles would gang up on the Jews and kill them. And perhaps this, we know this went on in different places over history. And it comes up in a very famous sugya in Eruvin where they're worried about like one Jew alone in a chatzer with a lot of Gentiles. And there was this fear that they were going to gang up and kill the person, and no one would know and all that. So they don't want you to create strongholds of Gentiles in Jewish neighborhoods. By the way, this would only be in a Jewish neighborhood. If there's no Jews living there, let's say you own a property in a place where there's no Jews, it's not an issue. It's only where there's a community of Jews, or let's say all the Jews decide to leave the community all at once, and they all sell their property at the same time, that wouldn't be an issue. So the issue, right, the issue is we don't want the Gentiles living among the Jews in large groups. It seems to be fear that they're going to, it doesn't say it here, but it definitely says in other sugyas that are similar to this, that it's fear of the danger. Okay? They might gang up on the Jew. Now they ask a question. According to this, I could theoretically, if I own 3 properties right next to each other, I could sell it to 1 Gentile. I just can't sell it to 3, because the problem is 3 people. So they say, should we be concerned if a Jew sells to 1 Gentile 3 houses, and then that Gentile sells the property to 2 other people? Aren't we worried about that? To which they answer, Amar Abaye, alifne mifakdinan, alifne delifne lo mifakdinan. We're worried about lifnei iver, don't put a stumbling block in front of one person, but we're not worried that if you put a stumbling block in front of one person, or not that. If you do it for one person, there's no stumbling block, but they might do it, they might sell. Okay, this we had actually in a different sugya on Yudalit. And actually, what does lifnei iver have anything to do with this? Good question, okay? Some people think that we're just quoting the line from there and applying it to here. It's just saying that's already going too far, okay? We don't do this because they might do that. That already we don't worry. And by the way, the other case is very similar. You were allowed to sell something to a Gentile if they weren't going to use it for idol worship, even though they might sell it to Gentiles who are going to use it for idol worship. And that was lifnei iver, because then you're making them perhaps worship the idol. But if the middle person isn't going to worship the idol, you're allowed to sell it to them, even if maybe they're going to sell it to somebody else. You don't have to worry about that. So some people just say this is just the same concept of I can sell to one and I don't have to worry what that one does down the road. But some people try to connect it with actually lifnei iver, but we're going to leave that aside right now. Now we say, even when they say in the situations where you're allowed to rent, you can't rent it if they're going to put, right? You can't rent it a house, a place where people live. Okay, you can only rent like a warehouse, something like that, a storage house. Now they're just going to point out, this sounds like there are places where, right, it sounds, when a place where you can rent, which sounds like there are places you can't rent. Well, okay, we know that, so why is this such a big deal? Well, stama de Rabbi Meir. Okay, turning now to Amabet, they say this line in the Mishnah is stama ki Rabbi Meir. Why? Now for this you have to look at the chart. Because if you look at the chart and you see what's forbidden, according to Rabbi Yossi, you will see that Rabbi Yossi does not forbid renting houses at all. He says, in Israel, you can't sell a house, but you can rent a house. And therefore, obviously in Syria, and obviously in Chutzlaret, you can rent a house anywhere. So, obviously this line doesn't accord like Rabbi Yossi. It has to be like Rabbi Meir, which by the way makes sense, because Stam Mishnah is usually like Rabbi Meir. And therefore, this line just happens to fit with Rabbi Meir, D'ika Rabbi Yossi, B'chol Duchta Mogre. He says you're always allowed to rent out houses. There is no place. And again, this is just from the language. It's not the content of what it says. It says, in the places where you can rent, right, in the areas, geographical areas where you're permitted to rent, you can't rent a house. Now, in the areas where it's permitted to rent, sounds like there's areas where it's forbidden to rent out houses. And that's not Rabbi Yossi, because Rabbi Yossi doesn't forbid that. Which, by the way, is just interesting to note, because the Stam Mishnah goes like Rabbi Meir, but Shmuel held like Rabbi Yossi, which is also interesting. Now we get to the fact that you can't ever rent out a bathhouse. And now we're up to the issue of Shabbat, that they're going to do Malacha on Shabbat, and people will say, look, the Jews working on Shabbat. So Tanya, the Braita, brings a longer version of this in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel omer, lo yiskor adam merchatzo lo vei kochavim mipnei shnei kral shmo. That's what we quoted in the Mishnah, because it's the Beit Merchatz is called in your name. Okay, and they do malacha on Shabbat and Yom Tov, and that's the problem. There it says it explicitly in the Tanaitic source what the issue is. I told you before, it didn't say it in the Mishnah. Now they're going to infer something, and then both this and the next line, the next section, are going to infer what about a Cuti. Cuti, if you remember, is the Shomerdim, right? They sort of became Jewish. It's machloket if they were Gerei Emet, they were Gerei Arayot. Okay, but what's known about them is they did keep certain halachot, and there were other halachot they weren't so careful about. So they say here, it sounds like, right? It sounds like you can't rent out to a Gentile, but you can rent out to a Cuti. Now, why would you be allowed to rent out to a Cuti? Now, we're going to see that Kutim keep Shabbat and keep Yom Tov, but they're not careful about Chol HaMoed. So, Cuti, Emer Avi Bei Malacha B'Chol HaMoed. Why should we allow them to rent out your bathhouse? They're going to do malacha on Chol HaMoed in your bathhouse. And people say, look, the Jew does malacha on Chol HaMoed. And we know it's a little less strict malacha on Chol HaMoed, but still. So they say, B'Chol HaMoed Ayin Nami Avdina. What do you mean? We also do malacha on Chol HaMoed. Meaning, in the bathhouse, what's the malacha they do? They boil water, right? They need hot water for the bathhouse. That's the main thing you have to do, though. You're machalel Chol HaMoed. Well, if you boil water on Chol HaMoed, right? We boil water on Chol HaMoed. Boiling water, even, let's say, okay, I boil water for my house for eating. Obviously, a bathhouse is a much more serious operation, but it's called a ma'aseh hedyot, according to the commentaries. It's an actually, you don't need a specialist to do, right? Like, you're not allowed to go to, let's say, to a seamstress and have a seamstress do something for you on Chol HaMoed. That's malacha. But to have, to sew a button is different, possibly. So this is what we call a maseh yo, which is permitted on Yom Tov, and it's litzorech hamoed. People need to shower, right? You need to take a bath. You need to get yourself clean. So basically, for all those reasons, it would be permitted, and that's why obviously it's permitted for the Cuti. Now we get into an interesting issue. Aval sadehu lovei kochavim mai share. Well, this says, right, in a place where you can rent, right, you can't rent out your bathhouse because you'll do malacha on Shabbat. But it doesn't talk about a field. Now, why not? Wouldn't it be the same thing with a field? I can't rent out my field to a Gentile because the Gentile will do work in my field on Shabbat, which is obviously all malacha. Can't do that. And people will say, look, Mr. Cohen has workers in his field on Shabbat. So isn't that a problem? Well, my taima, why is it actually permitted? Because again, it doesn't say it's forbidden. It only says the bathhouse. Arisa arisute ka'avid. Because normally, when people work in your fields, they work as sharecroppers. And sharecroppers, they're doing their own work, really, on Shabbat. Because they're working for themselves, because they're working to make their percentage. So people aren't going to say, oh, look, the Cohen's field is being worked on Shabbat, because they'll know the sharecropper's doing it for their own sake. Okay. This gets into a super interesting issue. I'll just finish one more line about this, and then we'll go into Tosfot for a quick minute. Why don't we say this about the merchatz? Can't you say people will know that the person's renting out the bathhouse for the time being? So they say arisa de merchatz lo avdei. That's not the way they do arrangements in a merchatz. It's usually if I rent it out, it means they're working in my merchatz. And almost schirut they're saying here is more like hiring Gentiles to work your bathhouse on Shabbat would be a problem because it kind of looks like it's yours and maybe it even is yours. Whereas an aris is doing work for their own sake. And even if they're working for you and you're getting X percentage, they're taking X percentage, it's really they're doing it sort of like on their own time, on their own thing. Now, this is a fascinating topic and it relates to so many issues we learned in Masechet Shabbat. I just wanted to read you some highlights of this very long Tosfot, Aris Arisute Kavit. So Tosfot starts out and says that Rabbeinu Tam Paskins, like Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, that Aris Arisute Kavit, and mitoch kach, based on that, he permitted a Jew, I'm not going to read the words in Hebrew, but he permitted a Jew who gives his house to someone to build, to allow the builders to build it on Shabbat. Okay? Rabbeinu Tam permits, say builders, right, they have a job, okay, it's like you bring something to the dry cleaners. Now, they can decide, if it's a non-Jewish dry cleaner, they can decide when they want to do the work for you. As long as you don't bring it to them right before Shabbat and expect it right after Shabbat, it's up to them to decide. The question is, it comes up in Masechet Shabbat, can you do it in your own house? Well, he claims, based on this, if they could be working in your field, then they could be working in your house. It's clear they were hired for a job, not for the hour, and therefore they can build your house on Shabbat. Fascinating. Well, what's even more fascinating is comes Rabbeinu Yitzchak in the middle of the Tosfot. And first of all, Rabbeinu Tam brings proof after proof after proof. Rabbi Yitzchak says, Kablanut of a house is completely forbidden, and he rejects all the proofs of Rabbeinu Tam. Okay, Rabbeinu Tam is known to try to also justify customs in his day. So he rejects all that. And then he says, in a house, it's really more like they're working for the day, and therefore he doesn't permit it. Tosfot ends with saying, which I thought was a fascinating line, that Rabbeinu Tam, even though he permitted this, when he built his own house, he would not let his workers work on Shabbat. So they point out that, he was unwilling to do this for himself. And then they bring the Ram, who says that he gave another reason why it's permitted to do your fields, because you're actually getting paid by the produce of the field, as opposed to getting paid with money. Okay, if the person who's working for you gets paid in money, it would be a problem. If they get paid by the produce of whatever they're doing, then it's a different situation. Okay, and then that would be also different from the house. They're not getting a part of your house. Unless you're paying them to build your house and they'll, live in part of the house. Then it would be a different story, which you could see the difference. Anyway, fascinating topic, and obviously they were all grappling with it because people were probably doing it. Or people wanted to know if this kind of thing is allowed. Okay, we'll finish up with the last line. Tanya, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer, now they bring a braita. Lo yaskir adam sadehu lekuti. Getting back to this Cuti and non-Jew. So you can't rent out your house to a Cuti. Mipnei shenikret al shmo. V'kuti zeh oseh bo malacha b'chalosh hamoed. Here you have the issue of the field is a problem with the Cuti because, what do we say? You do work on Chol HaMoed. Now that's a problem in your field. You can't do work on Chol HaMoed. You can't work the field. You can do things just davar ha'aved, like if it'll get ruined. But to really work the field, you can't, and the Cuti is going to work your field. Now wait. Aval ovei kochavim mai share. Da'amar arisa arisute avid. How can we be more machmir with the kuti than with the Gentile? The Gentile can do it because we can say he's an aris. Yachi kuti nami amre arisa arisute avid. Why wouldn't we say that a kuti can rent your field because they're anyway just working as a sharecropper and no one's going to be suspect that it's your field being that you hired someone to work your field on Shabbat? And with that, we're ending with a question. We'll get back to this tomorrow. So basically what we did today is we saw this machlok at Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yossi about what's permitted in what location, how many gzeirot are we going to do, and what gzeirot are we going to forbid. Really the isur being, number one, selling a house because of lo techanem, and selling a field because of both lo techanem and kedushat haaretz, and removing the mitzvot that are tliyot ba'aretz by selling it. And that's why the sadeh always was stricter, whatever it was, sometimes the house was as strict, but when there was reason to distinguish, there was a distinction there. From there we got to, concepts of engusrum gzeirah, concepts of if you're renting to someone who, what will be called in your name, what won't be called in your name, and issues of the difference between an aris and the way we hire workers in other situations. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day.